So hello and welcome. Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Emily Preziotti. I am the Community Wildlife Coordinator at the National Wildlife Federation, and today you have joined our webinar, How to Garden for Wildlife, where our featured speaker, David Mizejewski, will go over all the tips and tricks to attract local birds, bees, and other wildlife. A couple of housekeeping items before I go ahead and introduce David. If you have any questions during the webinar that you would like David to answer during our Q&A session, that's the last 10 minutes or so of our presentation, please go ahead and submit those in the Q&A box that's at the very bottom of your screen. I'd also like to say that this webinar is being recorded and will be available publicly following our presentation. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to David, and many of you may already know from his multiple media appearances on shows such as NBC's Today Show, The Wendy Williams Show, and Conan. But for those that don't, David Mizejewski is our resident celebrity naturalist at the National Wildlife Federation. He is an expert in wildlife and the environment, holding a degree in human and natural ecology from Emory University, and he specializes in urban ecology. David is dedicated to using his knowledge and his enthusiasm to help others understand and protect wildlife, and help people restore wildlife habitat in their cities, towns, neighborhoods, backyards, and gardens, which is the subject of his book, Attracting Birds, Butterflies, and Other Backyard Wildlife, and of course, the topic of today's webinar, How to Garden for Wildlife. So with that, please join me in welcoming David Mizejewski, and take it away, David.
Thank you so much, Emily. I am super excited to be here with all of you guys today. Normally, I am traveling the country at this time of year doing this talk, and with the COVID-19 pandemic, the National Wildlife Federation has grounded all travel, and we're all staying home and trying to stay safe and social and physically distanced. So I'm really excited because I miss giving this talk. And so with the magic of Zoom, you guys are gonna get to hear the presentation that I typically give at all the big garden shows and birding shows and that kind of thing. So without further ado, let's dive in. I'm gonna go pretty quickly. I've got a lot to cover. As Emily said, we'll do some Q&A at the end. But if you do have questions while you're going, pop them into that question box and we will hopefully get to them all. So I wanna start by just saying a little bit about the National Wildlife Federation. We're one of the oldest and largest wildlife conservation and education organizations. We've been around since 1936. And this is our mission. It's to unite all Americans to ensure that wildlife thrive in a rapidly changing future. And it's probably no surprise to anybody on this call that we human beings are the major cause of that rapid change. And I'm not gonna lie, a lot of the news is bad. Globally, we've got 1 million+ species that are endangered with extinction. Here in America, 1/3 of all of our wildlife species are at increased risk of extinction in the coming decades. Some recent studies have shown that the North American bird population is declining. We have about 3 billion less birds in North America today than we did just 50 years ago. The monarch butterfly population is declining. Bee populations are declining. I'm sure you guys have heard all that. And I promise you that this is not going to be a gloom and doom presentation. It's going to be positive and focused on how each of you can make a difference for all of those declining species literally right outside your door. But I did want to start with that because it's important to have that context. A lot of our species are disappearing. We are in a wildlife crisis. We are in an extinction crisis. And we've got a lot of work to do. And it can start with planting a wildlife habitat garden, which is what we're going to talk about today. So, getting back to the National Wildlife Federation, we do our work to ensure that wildlife thrive in a rapidly changing future in a whole wide variety of ways. Back in Washington, D.C., we're fighting to be a voice for wildlife, to make sure we have good, strong wildlife legislation. We're working right now on promoting the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which would get some funding to help species before they get to the point of being endangered. It's a really important thing. If you're interested in that, you can Google it. Maybe we'll throw a link up into the chat. But we're working in California to build a highway overpass for declining mountain lion populations and other wildlife. We're working in places like the Great Lakes and the Mississippi Delta and the Gulf of Mexico to ensure wetland protections for those great bodies of water, both for people and wildlife. We're working in North Carolina with our state affiliate there, the North Carolina Wildlife Federation, to help critically endangered red wolves. We're working to reintroduce bison to their native grassland habitats in the central part of the country. A few years ago, I got to see the very first bison calf born on the Wind River Eastern Shoshone Reservation in Wyoming. It's, I didn't actually see it born, but I saw it a couple months later. And really, even just saying that gives me chills. That's the work that the National Wildlife Federation is doing. We also publish Ranger Rick magazine and Zoo Books magazines and have a whole bunch of programs and opportunities to help people get connected to nature. But you'll notice a lot of those wildlife species that I just mentioned are big, furry, feathered, what we call charismatic wildlife. But this is wildlife too. This, as most of you probably know, is a monarch butterfly. And I already mentioned that monarch butterfly populations are really crashing right now and they're in real trouble. And the reality is that insects are wildlife. They count, they're important. You don't have to be a mammal or a bird or a reptile in order to be a wild animal. And so insects happen to be a group of wildlife that can particularly benefit by how you choose to garden or landscape your property. And so, at National Wildlife Federation, we do have a broad and inclusive definition of what wildlife are. And so that brings us to our Garden for Wildlife program. And again, that's what we're going to be talking about today. This is a program that we've been doing since 1973. We've been encouraging people to create wildlife-friendly gardens and landscapes to help support the local wildlife populations for 47 years. This is the program that the National Wildlife Federation has that really focuses on wildlife in what I call the human-dominated landscape. So not often the wilderness areas, but within our cities, our towns, our neighborhoods, and our own yards. And so it's Garden for Wildlife Month. Every May we designate as Garden for Wildlife Month. And it's just a time where we really try to get the word out about how important this activity is and how everybody can participate. And, it's fun and it gives you great opportunities to connect with nature, but it also helps out the wildlife. So one of the first things, though, when you start talking about gardening for wildlife, especially when I'm out and about talking to garden groups versus, say, a birding group or a butterfly group, is people kind of scratch their heads and they say, well, wait a second. I was always taught that you don't want wildlife in the garden. They're going to eat everything. They're going to destroy it, right? So here's why a wildlife conservation group has a garden program. It's because plants are the foundation of wildlife habitat. They're the bottom of the food web. And without plants, you can't have wildlife populations. And that's true, again, out in the wilderness areas, but it's also true, again, in our cities, our towns, and our neighborhoods, and our yards. The next level up in the food web after the plants are the insects, which, as I just mentioned, are important wildlife in and of themselves that deserve, to be able to exist. But one of their roles in that food web is to be the first layer of protein. And so you've got your plants and then you've got the insects. And the reality is that the majority of insects out there that rely on plants for part of their food or their reproductive cycles can only survive on the plants that they evolved with, that they share an evolutionary history with. And that leads us to this idea of native plants. Now, again, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with what the concept of native plants are all about, but in short, native plants are just the plants that naturally evolved in your region. And here in North America, we've got a couple dozen ecoregions, and they all have slightly different sort of plant communities that make them up, even within those ecoregions. And so these are the plants that wildlife, again, over hundreds of thousands, even millions of years, co-evolved with, and their life cycles are in sync with each other. So they become really important when you're thinking about what do I need to do in order to create a wildlife garden. And this is basically, they're going to be your building blocks, and we're going to talk a lot more about that as we go on. From a gardening point of view, native plants are great because they evolved in your region. They're adapted to your climate and to your weather and precipitation, water levels, to the soil types, and of course to the wildlife usage. But that means that as garden plants, they oftentimes are super low maintenance. Once you plant them and get them established, they don't need a lot of extra fussy care like fertilizer and extra watering because they naturally belong in the area, so they're going to thrive. So to underscore how important native plants are, I want to share some numbers with you. Now, a lot of the information that I'm sharing with you actually comes from the research of Dr. Doug Tallamy. You might be familiar with Doug. He actually kicked off Garden for Wildlife Month with his own webinar a few weeks ago. And so Dr. Tallamy is great because he's doing all of this research that specifically looks at the impact of native plants in our yards and gardens in suburban and urban environments and how they impact wildlife populations. So through his research, he's shown that our native oaks, the genus Quercus, support the caterpillars of 557 species of butterflies and moths. Now compare that to a commonly planted, city street tree. You can still buy them in nurseries. The ginkgo, ancient species, was native in North America, hundreds of thousands, millions of years ago, is not really a native plant anymore. And it's lost the connections, the ecosystem connections that it might once have had here. And so it doesn't support anything. Compared to an oak versus a ginkgo, you can see the power of the plant choice when it comes to supporting wildlife populations. And again, when you know that insects are really important wildlife for the food web, then it becomes even more powerful what you choose to plant in your yard. So that's really what this is all about. Wildlife need native plants to survive. And what we're hoping to encourage all of you to do with the Garden for Wildlife program and through Garden for Wildlife Month is to just plant more natives. That's the core concept here. And the act of planting with a purpose, which is kind of our tagline for the Garden for Wildlife movement that we have created, all those 47 years ago, is the goal here is to plant with a purpose. And that literally is the definition of gardening. When you plant tomatoes and eggplants and squash because you like to eat them, you're a vegetable gardener. Well, when you plant native plants to support your local birds and butterflies and bees and other wildlife, that makes you a wildlife gardener, and hence the Garden for Wildlife program. So let's talk about what we mean by wildlife. Everybody loves birds and butterflies. I can't see all of you, but show of hands, how many of you would like to see more beautiful birds and butterflies in your yard? Ooh, I can see you. Everyone's raising their hand. I love it. Well, if you didn't raise your hand, you've come to the wrong webinar, because that's what we're talking about here today. But yeah, it's easy to love birds and butterflies because they're pretty and they're not destructive or anything like that. But the really neat thing is that when you create a wildlife habitat garden to attract the birds and the butterflies, which are kind of the easy sell, they're kind of the gateway animals into this whole idea of natural gardening, all sorts of other fantastic species are going to benefit. Butterflies are beautiful, but they kind of hog all the attention in the insect world when it comes to kind of desirable insects. Take a look at this beautiful damselfly. How gorgeous. Wouldn't that be amazing to see flying around in your yard? This amphibians like this green tree frog are declining around the globe. In fact, faster than any other group of vertebrates, amphibians are disappearing. How amazing is it to think that what you do right outside your door can actually help support your local amphibian population? So when you create a garden, even if you're kind of focused on the birds and the butterflies, you're going to help out lots and lots of other species and hopefully be really surprised at some of the cool wildlife neighbors that show up. Now, yeah, sometimes animals that might scare us or could sting us will be present. And I just want to give a little bit of a shout out to these animals, because usually our reaction to them is way overblown to any actual threat that they pose to us. Snakes. A lot of people are terrified of snakes. A lot of people hate snakes. I still hear people say things like, only good snake is a dead snake. Please don't say that. The reality is that almost all snake species are 100% harmless to people. I'm going to repeat that. Almost all snake species are 100% harmless to people. Chances are any snake that you encounter in your yard is actually going to be a beneficial species, like this garter snake, which is out there eating things like rodents and earthworms and slugs and maybe the occasional frog, right? So these are not dangerous animals. They're not going to hurt you. Let them go on their way. Wasps, yes, they can sting us. This happens to be a golden digger wasp, a really cool species found across much of North America. And what you might not know is that, like their bee cousins, wasps are pollinators. We're going to talk about bees in a little bit too, but they're really important wildlife, providing an important ecological service. Unlike bees, wasps, most species, are also predatory or parasitic. They are out there tirelessly patrolling the garden, helping to keep the actual pests under control. So I just share this to say that if you encounter animals like this in your yard or your garden, it's actually okay. Just practice the golden rule that we teach kids, and that's never approach or touch or pet or try to get near any wild animal, and your chances of being bitten, scratched, stung become essentially zero in most cases. So just seeing them out there doesn't mean that you need to reach for the trap or the poison. Just let them go about their business, and you'll be doing the whole ecosystem a favor. Now, when you create a wildlife garden, you might also attract animals that, yes, can sometimes be a little bit of a nuisance. And I share this just to say that it's okay if you want to do things to exclude certain types of wildlife. I know the deer could be a problem. They can come in and devour everything to the ground. Raccoons, yeah, sometimes they can get into our trash cans. But the reality is that almost always resolving these kinds of wildlife conflicts is just some simple things on our part. You have raccoons hitting your trash cans. Get a trash can with a really tight fitting lid that snaps. Use bungee cords. Usually that will stop any kind of troublesome behavior, and you can let these guys go about their business. When predators show up in your wildlife garden, and they will, it's no cause for panic. I'm not talking about mountain lions or grizzly bears or things like that, but a red fox. These animals are a lot smaller than they look. The average weight of an adult male red fox is around 15 pounds. These guys are really not that much bigger than a house cat. They just have longer legs and bigger tails. They're feeding on insects and rodents and berries. They're not going to come after you or your pets or your kids. The bird there is a roadrunner. If you live further out west, you might see these guys in your yard. And by the way, I included this picture for anybody that was traumatized by that close-up of the snake. They're out there playing an important role. Predators have been eradicated across the planet by humans because we've kind of anthropomorphized them, and because they kill to survive, we've said they're bad, and historically we've wiped them out. And you can't have a healthy ecosystem, even an ecosystem in your garden, without predators. So if they show up, again, you don't need to call animal control. You definitely don't need to tweet me in a panic wondering what to do. Again, just sit back and enjoy a cool wildlife sighting. And then lastly, the wildlife garden is for birds and butterflies and damselflies and wasps and snakes and foxes, but it's also for people too. So make sure you plan a spot for yourself so that you can actually get outside and enjoy seeing all the amazing wildlife that you're going to support. Gardening for wildlife is something that people of all ages can get involved in. It's something that you can do anywhere. It's a great activity to do with your family, with your grandkids. So, what better way to experience the natural world, especially now when many of us are still, kind of staying at home, than literally walking right outside your door. You don't have to travel far to see wildlife if you create a wildlife habitat garden. So let's talk about what makes up a wildlife habitat garden. Now, we talked already a little bit about native plants, which are your foundations, but the way that we talk about it at the National Wildlife Federation is that all wildlife species need 4 things to survive. They're food, water, cover, and places to raise young. And I'm going to talk about each one of those in a little bit more detail. When you provide those 4 things and you commit to gardening in a natural, sustainable, environmentally friendly way, those are the 5 requirements on getting your yard or garden space certified by the National Wildlife Federation. And I'm going to talk about that at the very end. It's a really neat way to get recognized and to kind of join the movement and help support our work to get even more people doing this. So stay tuned for that. All right, so let's dive right into the specifics of those 4 components of habitat. So food is the first one. Obviously, all wildlife species need to eat. Probably a lot of you guys have bird feeders. I have bird feeders out. Show of hands, how many of you guys are feeding birds? Let's see. As I expected, lots and lots of hands are going up. There's nothing wrong with putting out some bird feeders. But here's the thing. Feeders aren't habitat. And that's because the research shows that birds really only use feeders as a supplement to the natural foods that they find out in the environment. And also only a handful of bird species will even visit a feeder. So the better way and the more kind of holistic, sustainable way to feed the birds is through your plants, and preferably your native plants. Plants are going to provide food for birds and all sorts of other wildlife in a whole wide variety of ways. So they're providing food in the form of seeds, like this goldfinch that's munching on some sunflower seeds, or the squirrel that's eating the seeds out of what I think is a spruce cone, but pine cones, whatever. Important food sources there. Berries, like the cedar waxwing here is eating. These are ways that your native plants, fruit and seeds and things like that, nuts, are going to be an important food source for the wildlife that you're trying to attract. Your plants are also going to provide nectar. Lots and lots of wildlife species feed on nectar, like bees and butterflies, and also moths and hummingbirds. And hopefully you can tell the difference here. The one on the right is the hummingbird. The one on the left is a hummingbird moth. And I want to give a shout out to moths because as I already mentioned, butterflies tend to hog up the attention when it comes to beautiful insects. But moths are pretty cool. And yes, a lot of them are not as colorful as their butterfly descendants. Butterflies actually evolved from moths. They're kind of, if you want to think of it this way, a day-flying moth. But a lot of moth species are really fascinating as far as appearance goes. I mean, and who wouldn't want this beautiful hummingbird moth flitting around their garden, right? So you want to think about attracting not just butterflies, but moths too. Other ways that your plants are providing food that you might not even have thought about. That woodpecker there is a sapsucker. It's drilling little ports in the bark of the tree, and a little bit of sap comes out. And sap is really just sugar water. It's kind of like the tree version of nectar. You know, nectar is sugar water that goes into flowers. Well, sap is in the, under the bark of the trees. And these sapsuckers drill it. They can drink that water up. Hummingbirds oftentimes will use that as a resource. Insects will use it as a resource. So just kind of a surprising way that you might not have thought of your plants providing food for wildlife. Now check out that bee in the middle. She is gathering, and drinking nectar, but check out her back leg there. It's covered in pollen. Pollen's a really important food source, particularly for bees, particularly for our native bees. So, yes, if you have allergies, you probably don't like to hear that, but just know that most of our showy blooming plants are not really causing your allergies. It's the plants that are wind pollinated that don't have showy flowers are the ones that typically are causing our allergies. So you can feel good about filling your yard with lots of blooming native plants. And then the other way that plants are providing food is, yes, through their leaves and their branches sometimes. So yes, some of your plants are going to get eaten. That's okay. That's what happens in nature. This is a fritillary butterfly munching on its host plant, which is passion bomb. And so that is going to turn into, even though it's kind of a scary looking caterpillar, I'll give you that. Looks like something out of a Godzilla movie, but it's going to turn into a beautiful fritillary butterfly. And some wildlife species need to feed on plants in order to survive. And here's what I always say to put things in perspective when it comes to the idea that, yes, some of your plants are going to get eaten. And some of the leaves are going to have holes in them. When was the last time you went out to your favorite, wild area and looked out at the beautiful natural vista and thought to yourself, man, look at all the insect damage on all of those plants? You probably didn't do that, right? Because it's about sort of scale and perspective, right? But I guarantee you, if you walk up to any plant out in nature and really looked at it, you'd see all sorts of evidence of the leaves being eaten, the branches being browsed on. So that's okay. A lot of times how you plant your garden can help minimize that. So if you plant densely, you're not going to really notice when one or two plants get munched on. So after the plants as your core of the base of that food chain, which again are providing food for wildlife in the form of seeds, berries, nuts, nectar, sap, pollen, and even their leaves, insects are the next level up in the food web. And birds in particular really rely on insects as a protein source. All sorts of birds feed on insects, including hummingbirds. They don't just feed on flower nectar alone. And it's a lot of birds. Like I said, 96% of our backyard birds feed their babies a diet of insects, primarily caterpillars, followed by crickets and grasshoppers, and then followed by spiders, which are not insects, of course, but invertebrates. So these insects and other invertebrates are critically important as wildlife. You want them around just to exist, but also because if you want to attract birds, you absolutely have to be supporting the populations of insects and other invertebrates. You can't have one without the other. And again, for conventional gardening, that flies in the face of what historically we've been taught in this country about gardening. And that is that bugs are bad, get rid of them, spray them, squash them. But the reality is that they're necessary and you need them. And really what you should be focusing on first is trying to build up that insect population, and all the other wildlife species will come. Again, this is more research from Dr. Doug Tallamy. And to illustrate just how important it is to attract a lot of insects to your yard, again, another study from Dr. Tallamy showed, and his crew, showed that it took one family of chickadees in order to raise successfully one nest of babies. They had to catch between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars. And they really are only foraging and hunting for those caterpillars within about, say, 150 feet of their nest. And that's over like a 16-day period. They had to catch that many just to raise one nest of babies. This is wildlife conservation on the scale of your yard. Think about that example of the oak tree versus the ginkgo. In some cases, one plant choice planting that oak tree versus something non-native that doesn't support the insect populations could mean the difference between this family of chickadees actually being able to raise those babies and having them survive. It's powerful stuff, and it is real wildlife conservation. Wildlife conservation doesn't just happen off, again, in wildlife preserves and national forests. It can happen right in your own yard. And by the way, chickadees are tiny. That goes for all the other birds, all the way up to woodpeckers. So building on the food web. And I know this slide can be a little bit challenging for folks, if you're a little bit squeamish, but as I was mentioning earlier, predators are important, and they deserve to exist, and they play an important role. So, after the insects, all the other animals, the little animals that are eating the insects, get eaten by other bigger animals. The snakes are eating the frogs, the owls are eating the snakes, the weasels are eating the rodents, by the way, providing natural rodent control. And we have weasels all across this country. They're very elusive. You probably won't ever see them, but if you have a good wildlife habitat, they'll be out there playing that important function. So on and on it goes. It starts with your native plants, then the insects and the smaller critters, and they eventually become food for the bigger animals, and you create a food web. And that's what this is all about. Now, going back to feeders, yeah, it's okay to supplement the natural foods that you're going to provide with some feeders, whether it's a suet feeder or a seed feeder or a nectar feeder, like the one with the oriole. But by the way, note that that oriole has an insect in its mouth, just underscoring how important the insects are, even if you have feeders. You just want to make sure you keep your feeders clean, wash them out and disinfect them regularly because they can spread disease. Keep your seed dry. If you have animals like raccoons or other things eating out of the bird feeders, you need to take them down. If you have this happening at your bird feeder, this is a hawk that is patrolling someone's bird feeder and looking for birds to eat. And I always tell people that when you put out seed feeders for birds that eat seeds, you're also putting out feeders for birds that eat birds. This is normal, folks. This is natural. And I know it can be traumatizing to see your favorite backyard songbird get eaten by a hawk, like a Cooper's hawk or a sharp-shinned hawk, which are the usual suspects. But just remember that hawks are birds too. They are native species. They need to eat. They need to feed their babies. And what you've done by putting out a feeder is attracting birds to one spot every day in high concentrations. And that's good as a birder, as a bird watcher, you want that. But it also attracts the predators. These hawks are no fools. They're going to see that as an opportunity. So if it really does bother you, some suggestions are to make sure you plant lots of dense plants. We're going to talk about that in a little bit when I get to cover, which is the third component of habitat, or just take your feeders down. If you fill your yard with lots of native plants that are providing all of those natural food sources, you don't necessarily need to have a feeder. You'll still have lots of birds to watch, but they'll just be dispersed a little bit more and not quite as vulnerable to predation from hawks. This is not what we're talking about when we talk about putting out food for wildlife. Again, it's all about building the food web with native plants and natural food sources. And while this picture is really cute, it's kind of heartwarming to see the mother raccoon and all these cute little babies. Sadly, what you're really looking at in this picture is a bunch of dead baby raccoons. A fed mammal is a dead mammal. And that's because unlike birds, which don't become dependent on feeders, they only use them as a supplement, as I've mentioned, mammals do tend to become habituated. They stop eating their natural foods. They come to rely on humans and associate us with food. And if that were to happen with a bird, it's not like a chickadee approaching people for food is going to be potentially dangerous, but it could be with an animal like a raccoon or a fox or something like that. So you want to keep these guys wild. You don't ever want to feed them artificially with bowls of cat food or table scraps or whatever. Build the natural habitat with native plants, and these guys will have plenty of natural food. Because even if you're okay with this in your yard, what happens when these little raccoons walk down to the neighbor's yard and approach a kid? Someone's going to call animal control, and that's the end of it. So it's kind of harsh, but this isn't about putting out handouts. Wildlife need habitat, not handouts. Same thing. If you have these guys visiting your bird feeders, you got to take them down. There's no way you're going to convince an animal like a black bear not to take advantage of this delicious high-calorie food source. And this could be a dangerous situation, mostly for the bears. So take the feeders down, focus on feeding naturally, put the feeders up again in the winter when the bears are going dormant. The one exception to the rule about never feeding mammals is this right here. If you happen to live in Arizona or New Mexico or maybe even Western Texas, you might be lucky enough to get one of the two nectar feeding bats. The lesser long-nosed and the Mexican long-tongue, I believe I have that right, bats are nectar feeders. They're, unlike most of our bats in North America, which are insect eaters, these guys drink flower nectar. And occasionally they will visit a nectar feeder that you put out for hummingbirds. So that's okay. And of course, if you're talking about mammals visiting feeders, you know if you're feeding birds that this happens. It's not the end of the world. Try not to overdo it. Squirrels are going to get into your bird feeders. It's okay. What I always recommend to people is maybe think about getting a squirrel-proof feeder and then letting me know how that works out for you. Because though these animals do not have very large brains and they're not known for their smarts, they somehow always figure out a way to get into the bird feeder. It just is what it is. So, all right, that's food. So again, food's all about planting native plants, providing natural sources of food, and building a food web. Second component of habitat is water. All wildlife species need to drink, and birds need to actually bathe. They need to keep their feathers in good condition. A bird that can't fly doesn't live very long. So, and some animals actually live in the water as their kind of entire habitat. And you'll see as I talk, a lot of these habitat components have major overlaps. So for an animal like this green frog, it needs a standing body of water as its kind of whole habitat. So, all wildlife species need water in one way or the other. Now, you might be lucky enough to have a big piece of property or be adjacent to a big natural body of water like this sort of, pond situation. If you have a body of water like this, what's really important is not to mow down right to the water's edge. That's not how it works in nature. And what that does is allow any kind of runoff, whether it's sediment or fertilizers or pesticides that might get put out into the landscape, those run right into the water and they really pollute the water and impact its benefit to wildlife. So let some natural vegetation grow up. These cattails and other sort of wetland emergent plants not only are going to filter any sediment or runoff before it hits the water, but they're providing lots of habitat to the wildlife. Now, most people don't have a water feature like this in their yard. Most people probably have the space for something like this. This is in my old backyard in Washington, D.C. I recently moved. This is just a 50-gallon plastic preformed pond that I put into my tiny little urban backyard. And, you'll notice that I have lots of plants in it. That's really important if you're using one of these prefab ponds with steep sides, because you want to make sure that wildlife that get in can actually get out. Even aquatic animals like frogs can drown if they can't actually have access out of the pond. So that's something really important. If you're digging a pond and using a flexible liner, which is honestly the better way to go, it's a little bit more work, you can actually build the grade so that you have a shallow end that will let animals get in and out. But either way, you want to put lots of plants in your water garden, preferably native plants, native water lilies and rushes, and there's lots of great native wetland plants out there. Not only does that give the ladders in and out of the pond, but it also provides shade for the pond, which will help keep algae down. The plants compete with algae for nutrients, so it'll keep your pond from turning into pea soup. And as always, the plants are actually habitat for the wildlife. But you don't have to have a pond. You could have a big pond, a smaller water garden, but a simple bird bath is all that's really required. Again, different animals are going to use water in different ways. So yes, if you have a big pond, yeah, maybe you'll attract ducks, maybe you'll attract herons, aquatic turtles. They're not going to visit a bird bath, but you'll get lots of other animals that do, like this robin. So a bird bath really is all you need in order to say that you check that box of providing a water source. You can add features to your, even just like a bird bath, things like bubblers or fountains or misters. These are little devices that you can get from birding stores. And I'll give a shout out to our partner, Wild Birds Unlimited. They have a lot of these products in their stores. They are a certified wildlife habitat champion. And so the sound of moving water or dripping water is actually really attractive to hummingbirds in particular. You never know who's going to visit a bird bath. It's not just for songbirds. Here are two barred owls visiting a bird bath. I believe this is down in Florida in a certified wildlife habitat yard. So, all sorts of wildlife will utilize a bird bath. And, if you put that bird bath, instead of it being up on a pedestal, you can even just put it on the ground. And birds will still visit it, but animals that can't fly or climb, like, toads or box turtles or things like that, will be able to use it as well. And we call them bird baths, but all sorts of wildlife will use them. Here are two different amphibians, a gray tree frog and a spring peeper. These are two species we have here in the east. They'll happily go take a dip in a bird bath. They need to keep their skin moist like most amphibians. So we call them bird baths, but they're for all sorts of different wildlife. Insects need water too. These are honeybees, which really aren't wildlife. They're a domesticated species. They're kind of like, a cow is to a bison, a honeybee is to a wild native bee. Most honeybees exist in managed hives by people, and they're important for our agriculture. But there's lots of wild native bees out there that are the actual true wildlife. But at any rate, all sorts of insects need water. And I include this picture of the honeybees because you can really see it. One thing that you can do is get a bird bath and fill it with rocks. Insects, which because they're tiny, can get trapped in the surface tension on the water and drown. So they don't like to visit a water source that has kind of a big surface area. So by putting these rocks in there, the birds will still come get a drink and things like that. And so can the insects. And they'll use them as landing spots. Even just a muddy area in your yard can be an important water source. So I'm giving you permission, if you have that spot that you have, never really dries out and kind of, is kind of muddy and grass won't grow, rather than get involved in, putting in expensive French drains or retaining walls and fill soil, just go with what Mother Nature gave you. And think of it as like a rain garden, an area that naturally stays wet. And, lots of wildlife will use that. Birds are perfectly happy to drink and bathe in a puddle. And in fact, butterflies engage in a behavior called puddling, where they consume the water in muddy areas, and it's filled with dissolved minerals. It's actually an important way that they get nutrients. So, think about planting some native wetland plants there, and instantly you'll have a beautiful wetland garden, and it won't be a problem in your landscape. It'll be a great wildlife feature. Now, while we're talking about water, let's talk about this gal. This is a mosquito, and everybody is rightly concerned about attracting mosquitoes. And your wildlife garden does not need to be a source for the mosquito population. Here's the deal. Mosquitoes take about 5 to 7 days to go through their aquatic larval phase before they emerge as winged adults, at which time the females will try to get a blood meal, which they need in order to get the protein in order to lay their eggs. Male mosquitoes don't bite, and in fact, mosquitoes otherwise feed on flower nectar and are pollinators. So I know I'm not going to convince you to have an appreciation for mosquitoes, but the more you know. And luckily, no plants are really dependent upon mosquitoes for pollinators, so you can feel good about trying to eliminate them in your yard. So all you have to do that, because they have that 5 to 7 day cycle, is just dump your bird bath out every couple days. And you'll get rid of and eliminate any mosquito eggs or larvae that are in there. And you know what? You need to do that anyway to keep the water clean for the birds. You can also buy devices, wigglers that you put in the water that keep the surface like this so that the mosquitoes won't land on it. Having a pond pump and something that, again, keeps the water surface will keep them from breeding in your pond. Or you can buy products that are called mosquito dunks or mosquito bits or granules. These are a natural soil bacteria that will target mosquitoes and fungus gnats and a few other biting flies, and they're pretty much harmless to everything else. So it's kind of an organic pest control, if you will. I actually use them in my garden pond, and they work really well. So that's something else that you can consider. The real thing you should look out for, though, are things like clogged gutters, any toys or decor or gardening equipment or whatever that is holding any water, and try to eliminate that, because that is where the mosquitoes are breeding. And and also you can even just put out like a fan on your patio. Mosquitoes are not big or strong flyers, so a strong gust from a big oscillating fan oftentimes is all you need to do to blow them away. Obviously wear insect repellents as well, and that'll minimize your chances of being bitten. I include this photo because this is an eastern bullfrog, which is a great species where here where I am in the east, great native species, but out west it's not native. And unfortunately, it's been introduced there in part by people buying tadpoles for their backyard ponds. And now the eastern bullfrog is established in the West, where it is literally eating some of our Western native frog species into extinction. And the message here is that, as tempting as it is that you really can't buy nature. If you've ever seen the movie Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. That's really the principle you want to kind of adopt here. Build the habitat. And if lots of us build the habitat, there'll be corridors of connectivity, and the wildlife will show up on their own. And one of the reasons why we don't recommend people going out and buying wildlife is because you don't know what species you're getting. You could be introducing the next non-native species. And by the way, that goes for buying ladybugs or praying mantises. Oftentimes those are the non-native species, which are real problems. So again, build a natural garden. The wildlife will show up on their own, including the native predators. And again, just because it's cute and you never know who's going to show up, even to a bird bath. These are some bobcat kittens in a certified wildlife habitat garden in Arizona. All right, so we've talked about food. We've talked about water. Let's go on to our third component of habitat, which is cover. Now, what is cover? This really kind of refers to the idea that animals need places to hide from predators, or if they're predators, they need places to hide from their prey so they can get a meal. Can you see the animals in these photos? Both of these are actually predators, both predators and prey. And notice where they are finding their cover. The lizard, which is a green anole lizard or anole, depending on how you want to pronounce it, is hiding in the vegetation. You can see its green coloration, it's camouflage there. The crab spider is as well. It also is camouflage in its coloration. Plants, just like with food, are going to be how you provide cover. And the same native plants that you're going to plant to provide those food sources are also going to provide cover for wildlife. So in addition to just sort of hiding places, wildlife also need cover as places to get out of the, away from the predators, but also the elements, wind, cold, heat, all of those things. Animals want to get out of that just like we do. They can't go indoors. So where do they seek that shelter? Oftentimes it's within your plants. And so, you might want to think about planting plants that have thorns, like this one, which just add another extra layer of protection for birds and other little animals that hide out within them. Evergreens are a really fantastic way of providing cover. They stay green year round, and they're really great sources of sort of blocking wind and rain and snow and things like that. But beyond kind of individual plants, and again, you want to focus on natives, this habitat component really gets into more of a garden design concept. And the principle here is that you want to plant densely. That's how Mother Nature plants in most cases, right? And it's not typically how we plant in most suburban areas. We just have these big lawns with a couple plants plunked in. Well, plant big groupings of native plants and you'll provide tons of cover. This is another certified wildlife habitat in Virginia. And you can see this is beautiful. Planting densely does not mean that your yard has to just be a wild looking mess filled with weeds, right? That's a myth about this idea of wildlife gardening. Sure, you can just let your property go wild and the wildlife will probably love that. Your neighbors probably won't though. So, the message here though is that you can plant densely and still have your yard be beautiful. I mean, this looks like something out of a magazine. So, and again, plant in clusters, plant lots of different species. Not only will you be providing lots of food, but also cover for all sorts of wildlife. Because look, the reality is many species are never gonna visit a typical suburban yard. This is a wood thrush, a species that's declining, one of those bird species that's rapidly disappearing in North America. And it's because they need kind of a woodland environment with a canopy trees and understory trees and shrubs beneath that. They need a leaf litter on the ground. And these are things that you can recreate. And again, think about habitat, not just horizontally, but vertically. So again, if you have a big oak tree, underplant it with a smaller understory tree, and all of a sudden you have all these different layers of habitat going on. Really great tip if you have a small yard too, because you might not have a lot of space this way, but you do have space this way. Again, lots of animals are living on the ground layer. Fallen woody debris, fallen down trees and logs and branches provide cover for all sorts of wildlife. This is a red-effed, the juvenile phase of the eastern red-spotted newt. Really, really cool little critter, but again, is not gonna visit a lawn. But if you have some dead logs out in your yard and some leaf litter, you might actually be able to support this guy. You can build a brush pile, by layering successively smaller branches and logs, save a dead log that has a hollow in it. These are all fantastic places where wildlife of all different sizes and types are gonna find cover. Of course, obviously, you probably don't wanna do this kind of cover if you live in an area where fire is a concern. So, you can mix and match all of the suggestions that I'm giving you here today. You don't have to put in every single one of these. It might not work for your scenario. In fact, when I lived in Washington, D.C., I lived right in the middle of the city, and I obviously was not going to build a brush pile because it probably would attract rats. So, that's okay. I just planted lots of dense native wildflowers, and that provided a lot of natural cover. I mentioned the leaf litter. Can you see the animal in this picture? This is in the National Wildlife Federation headquarters building, also in Virginia. And this is a toad, and it's hiding out in the leaf litter. The leaf litter is habitat. Tons of wildlife species need it to survive. And yet, in this country, we've been trained every year to rake up all the leaves and get rid of them and bag them up and send them to the landfill, which is horrible. Try to leave as many fallen leaves where they fall. They're the natural mulch, right? The trees lose their leaves. It falls to the base. It protects the roots. It preserves soil moisture. It provides wildlife habitat. Yet we rake them all up and get rid of them, and then we go out and buy mulch and fertilizer. It's kind of crazy if you think about it. So use the leaves as a natural mulch in your beds. Reduce the size of your lawn so more leaves can stay on property. And even if you do have to rake them up off of your, some parts of your yard, at least try to keep them on site, compost them, and they'll still do a lot to benefit wildlife. You can put out something fun and whimsical like a toad abode. Something simple like this seems silly, but lots of little critters will find shelter underneath it. Insect hotels are a big trend right now. These are structures that you build that have all sorts of little nooks and crannies in them for insects to hide out in and even to breed in. And that's the last component we're going to talk about in a second, which is places to raise young. The photo in the middle there is a butterfly house. Again, the idea there is that this is going to mimic the natural crevices in under bark and within plants that butterflies and other insects are going to use. There's really not a lot of science on these, on whether or not they're really helping or beneficial, but they certainly can't hurt. And in some ways, they kind of are more like garden art than anything. So they're okay to put out there. But again, you want to focus on providing the natural sources of cover by planting densely, keeping those the dead logs and trees and things like that. That's the natural places where wildlife are going to find cover. You can also put out a roosting box, which is a kind of birdhouse that's not designed for them to nest in, but for them to take shelter in. And you'll notice some design differences. There's a hole at the bottom instead of at the top. That helps the box retain heat. There's perches inside, which allow multiple birds to get in. And birds will sometimes use these on a cold winter's night. So that's something else you can think about as a way of providing a little bit of additional supplemental cover. All right, let's get into our final component of habitat. That's places to raise young. This one's really important, you guys, because it's all well and good to provide a food source and a place where wildlife can get a drink. But if we aren't providing wildlife with the resources that they need to find a mate, engage in courtship, to lay their eggs, build a nest, dig a den, raise their babies if the species does that, so that they can keep their species going forward, well, we're not really helping to solve the crisis of wildlife decline, right? And so you really want to think about this. And it's really less about a specific thing like food or water. It's more about thinking about the whole life cycle of the animals that you're trying to support and making sure that you equip parent animals with what they need to raise the next generation. So no surprises here. Just like with food and just like with cover, your plants are going to be the main way that you provide places to raise young. Birds, most species are building their nests either in the branches of trees or in tree cavities. Like the woodpeckers, where they drill a hole out and then they and lots of other bird species will then use that as a nesting place. So again, plant lots of trees and shrubs. Keep those dead and dying trees out there. Dead trees are full of life. They're full of baby birds. So as long as that dead tree isn't a risk to falling on your house or a danger, try to keep it standing if you can. It'll become a nursery for birds and all sorts of other wildlife. Even non-bird animals need a lot of plants in order to successfully raise their babies. At this time of year, folks are finding the deer fawns and the bunnies out there, and they're freaking out and thinking, oh, I have to rescue them. You don't. Mother deer and mother rabbits leave their babies alone, hidden in the vegetation, and only come to nurse them once or twice a day. And that keeps predators from finding them. So, but the point here is that if you plant densely, again, this is an overlap with cover, it's actually specifically needed by baby animals in order to survive. Even the little painted turtle there, which is an aquatic turtle species, it's mostly going to live in a pond. They hatch out of eggs built or dug into nests on land, and they need the cover of the vegetation in order to survive to get to the water. Now, you can supplement the natural nesting places for cavity nesting birds by putting out a birdhouse, or what I prefer to call it, a nesting box, because birds don't actually live in birdhouses. They specifically use them as a nesting spot. And there are a good number of birds that will use a human-made nesting box, but you want to make sure it's a good design. I always recommend going with natural materials If you get a nesting box that has lots of color and fanciful designs, oftentimes they're not very well built. So go with natural materials. You want to make sure the hole size is the right size for the birds you're attracting or trying to attract to nest there. In nature, birds are not flying around with little tape measures, but believe it or not, they can be pretty picky about the hole size when you put out a nesting box. You want to make sure the dimensions are accurate for the species you're trying to attract, that there's ventilation along the top, that there's drainage along the bottom, and never use one with a perch, which isn't really necessary for our native birds, but it's a nice little handle for a raccoon or another predator to hold on to when they're going in to get the baby bird. So you don't want to have a perch on your bird house or nesting box ever. And I mentioned too earlier that this is actually wildlife conservation. Nesting boxes have helped species like bluebirds, which by the middle of the last century had really begun to disappear because we had gotten rid of a lot of the old dead trees and fence posts as we converted a lot of America to suburbia that these birds were using as nesting spots. And so a movement of putting out bluebird nesting boxes got underway. And a few decades later, the bluebirds are actually doing okay, in part because of these nesting boxes. So it really is a conservation action to do this. It's not just birds that need nesting spots. I've mentioned a couple times about our wild native bee species. Globally, there's 20,000 species of bees. Here in North America, we've got about 4,000, and that does not include the domesticated honeybee. The majority of those bees are solitary, meaning they don't form hives, they don't live communally, and they don't make honey. They nest as individual females in little tunnels, either in the ground or in those dead standing trees or old logs. So this is habitat that you can provide to them. So, keep a little bit of bare soil. If you see ground nesting bees, please don't spray pesticides on them. That's what the female bees need. And what they do is they fill a little tunnel with little chambers with a little ball of nectar and pollen that they lay an egg on, and then they build a chamber wall. The baby bee hatches, eats that pollen ball, pupates, and then the next year usually will emerge to go out and keep the cycle going. So this is really important. A lot of these bee species are disappearing, and they are critically important wildlife to keep our ecosystems functioning because they're pollinating most of the flowering plants out there, allowing those plants to reproduce, but also form all of the seeds, the nuts, and the berries and everything that the other wildlife species need. So you really want to support our wild native bees. You can put out a bee nesting house. This is something that's also a new trend. You just want to be careful because these can be sinks where parasites build up. So you want to replace the tubes every year, and that means harvesting the bee cocoons. It's actually a lot of work. So I honestly wouldn't recommend it unless you're willing to do that work. And it's fine if you do, but this is just some that I had in my yard where you can see the tubes that got filled up by the native bees. You can put out a bowl of mud as a resource for nesting animals, particularly those bees. And yes, I had this in my yard, and yes, my neighbors thought I was nuts, but I did plant flowers around it, so it looked a little bit better. But at any rate, bees, those wild native bees, many of them use mud as a nesting material. So do birds. Robins and phoebes will use mud as a resource for their nests. So again, it might sound a little crazy, but this is a good way of providing a resource for animals that need mud as a building source for their nests. Bat houses, that's a form of cover, but if you put out a good bat house, you might actually attract a maternal colony that will use it as a place to raise young. Again, specs for bat houses, they should be much bigger than you probably think, at least 2 feet tall, at least 18 to 20 inches wide. You want to mount them on a pole, not on a tree. Bats won't use them if they're in a tree. At least 12 to 15 feet off the ground. The side of a building is even better. And then lastly, places to raise young too is about the idea that, again, animals in their juvenile phase oftentimes have completely different habitat components or requirements. So frogs and salamanders start out as aquatic larvae, completely different than their adult forms that oftentimes live on land and in the vegetation. They actually live like fish. So if you want to support them in this phase of life, you have to have that garden pond. Caterpillars, of course, are another great example. Butterflies and moths start out life as caterpillars that feed on the leaves of just a limited number of plants that they co-evolved with, that they have an immunity to that plant's natural chemical defenses. And so without those plants, which we call host plants, butterflies and moths cannot complete their life cycle and their populations plummet. And that, just for one little sidebar, is what's happening to the monarch butterfly. The monarch butterfly population in North America is disappearing. The eastern population, east of the Rockies, is anywhere from 60 to 90% down over the last 20 years, depending on the year, from their population highs back in the 90s. The Western population, there's less than 1% of them left. There's 99.4% loss of the Western monarch population. And it's largely because we've gotten rid of their only caterpillar host plant, milkweed. And just some charts, this is, I won't get into this, this is just the Eastern and the Western divide of the monarch butterfly and showing their migratory patterns. But since we're running short on time here, I want to zip through these. Just some charts showing the population decline of the Eastern monarch population and the Western monarch population. You don't have to really read the numbers there, but you can see the downward trajectory. It's not good. So what can you do to help? Plant their caterpillar host plant. Milkweed has a PR problem because it's got weed in the name and people don't like that. And it has this reputation for being an ugly, aggressive plant. It's just not true. We've got almost 100 different species of native milkweed here in North America. Every region has at least a few species, a few of which are in cultivation. So you can actually buy them at the garden center. These are all milkweeds. They're beautiful garden plants. Plant them and we'll hopefully begin to turn the tide for the monarch butterfly. All right, so that's the 4 components of habitat: food, water, cover, places to raise young. The last thing, and this is where I'll finish, is sustainable gardening. This is the 5th thing that you need to do in order to achieve certified wildlife habitat status. This is what we're up against, you guys. This is what I see as I travel the country, coast to coast. Same plants, same giant lawns, water hungry, chemical dependent, and dead. They don't support anything. This makes me sad. It kind of makes me a little bit angry too. This is what we're trying to transform. And I'm not saying that you necessarily have to get rid of every last piece of lawn. I know Americans love their lawns and sometimes we use them. Even I have a little bit of a lawn. In fact, this yard behind me is my new backyard. It's mostly lawn. I'm going to be changing that soon though. But at any rate, what we're hoping people will do is go from that first picture to something like this. There's still lawn, but there's a big, beautiful bed filled with native plants. And if all of us did this, we would immediately increase habitat for those declining birds, for the declining wild native bees, for the declining monarch butterflies, and lots of other wildlife species, while still having a beautiful yard that you can enjoy and isn't, going to look too crazy or wild for your neighborhood, right? So if everybody converted every year just a couple different garden beds, pretty soon we'd have some tremendous increases in wildlife habitat. You can do this anywhere, not just in your yard, in suburbia. We like to say that Garden for Wildlife is, wildlife habitat where people live, play, work, and worship. So you can create wildlife habitat gardens at your kids' or grandkids' schools, at the local library, at your place of work. Wherever you can plant things, you can create a wildlife habitat garden. So we want everybody to get really active, plant these gardens in your own yard, and then get out into your community and do it. That's how you get certified. And when you get certified, it's a way of NWF being able to recognize all of your great efforts. It's an honor system. I'm not going to show up in your yard with a clipboard and judge you. We've got an online application. What we're really trying to do, again, is create a movement. When you get certified, you become a National Wildlife Federation member. You get a subscription to National Wildlife Magazine. You get a subscription to the Garden for Wildlife newsletter. You get a 10% discount to our wildlife shop. And so it's a pretty good deal. And when you do it, you can get one of these awesome yard signs. We've got a few different models. And when you post those, you really do help us spread the word. This is a grassroots program. There's only so many of me out there and NWF staff that are out there spreading the word about this program. But when you get certified and you post a yard sign, you tremendously help us spread the word to your neighbors. You're reaching people that we never will with this message of, hey, all of us can get involved in wildlife conservation. All of us can help turn the tide for declining wildlife just by planting native plants and maintaining these natural gardens. So you get a great certificate. Again, this is some other pictures of our signs. So please, I encourage everybody to do that during Garden for Wildlife Month. It's a really great time to do it. And you probably already have a lot of the components already. And for Garden for Wildlife Month, we are having a great little promotion. We had this 20% off discount. I'll mention that we do have an application fee and we do charge for the signs. Those fees go right back into our program. So just want to be clear about that and upfront, but it is a way that we raise money at the National Wildlife Federation. We're a nonprofit to help us continue to do this work. So for Garden for Wildlife Month, we are offering some cool discounts. So again, check that out. Hopefully Emily can post that in the comments. And I'll finish with this, and I know we're pretty much out of time, but go to our website, nwf.org/garden. There's tons more information on there. Amazing resources, articles, features, links to native plants and things like that. So you definitely want to check that out, nwf.org/garden. I mentioned native plants. We've got a really cool tool called the Native Plant Finder, built on the research of Dr. Doug Tallamy, where you can get a list of the best native plants to support the caterpillars of butterflies and moths and the birds that eat them for your zip code based on actual science. So that's the Native Plant Finder. If you're on social media, you can find us on Facebook and on Twitter under Garden for Wildlife. I maintain those mostly, so when you're interacting with the page, you're interacting with me. So if you had questions that I couldn't get to today, definitely follow those pages, follow me on social media, and I'll do my best to respond to all of them. And then lastly, I have a book out there. It's called Attracting Birds, Butterflies, and Other Backyard Wildlife, which is another great resource that goes over everything that I talked about today, but in more detail. So hopefully we'll answer maybe some of those unanswered questions that we might not be able to get to, because I've gone a little long here. Apologies for that. So with that said, Emily, do you want to pop back on? I know we're right at 4 o'clock. I can stay if folks want to stay, and I can answer questions, but I want to be respectful of people's time.
Yeah, I think we have time for at least one question.
Okay.
So we received a question from an individual that says, I have been gardening with nature for several years now, and I'm elated to see the amount and variety of wildlife that's sharing our garden space with us. Since I have rolled out the welcome mat so enticingly, I am also wondering if I need to keep a healthy balance between various animals in mind.
So, number one, thank you for everything that you're doing to help support wildlife locally. And I'm thrilled to hear your real life experience that this actually does work. If you plant it, they will come, like I said before. So yeah, I think balance is important. And there's not too much that you need to actively do, I would say, to kind of manage the wildlife populations in your yard. The big thing that you can do to maintain that natural balance is plant a diversity of native plants. When you do that, that means you're going to support all sorts of different wildlife species, and they're going to help keep each other in check. And so, a lot of times with pest issues in gardens, those happen because we have kind of taken all the threads out of that food web, and we have maybe one big cluster of one kind of plant, an ornamental plant that is kind of like a sitting duck for the pests. But when you have clusters of different plants all planted in dense proximity to each other, you're going to attract a lot of, again, the insect predators and parasites and the songbirds and the dragonflies and the damselflies and the frogs that are going to help keep, and the wasps that are going to help keep the pest populations down. So I think that's my best advice to you about kind of maintaining the diversity of species and a good balance, is just plant lots of natives. The one other thing I'll say is, going back to what I was talking about not feeding mammals. One danger in doing that, in addition to it being bad for them, is that by artificially supporting what we call those mesopredators, so there's kind of like medium-sized mammals, again, the raccoons, foxes, skunks, possums, and things like that, by giving them handouts, you can actually artificially boost their populations in your neighborhoods, which then has a ripple effect, because they might then have a negative impact on, say, songbirds. They're eating their eggs and babies and things like that. So feed the wildlife naturally, and you won't really have issues with that, with things getting out of balance.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Dave. That was awesome. I'm also including David's social media accounts in the chat. So for those of you who asked really great questions, I'm sorry we were not able to get to them, but please visit the Garden for Wildlife website for more information and resources. Purchase David's book, which has a wealth of information inside it, and feel free to reach out to David via his social media networks to ask more questions. So. And
just to reiterate, we are going to save this and put it back out there. You can save the chat if there was good conversation going on there. And maybe I'll come back and I'll just do a Q&A session next.
Yes.
Because I know a lot of you guys have a lot of questions. And again, apologies, I get a little enthusiastic. I went a little bit long there. But so, we'll be in touch. Watch our social media pages, and maybe we'll schedule something soon for me to do another one of these just to answer your questions. Yeah, that sounds like a great idea.
Well, thank you so much, David, for this great presentation, and thank you to everyone for joining.
All right, happy Garden for Wildlife Month.